Alexander, the new king of Macedonia. After the assassination of King Philip II, Alexander, at just 20 years old, found himself burdened with the overwhelming responsibility of inheriting the throne of Macedonia. Surrounded by immense challenges, the young prince knew he had to quickly assert his authority over the kingdom his father had left behind. Philip II had been a great conqueror and military strategist, and for Alexander, this meant he had to prove himself in order to step out of his father's shadow and leave his own mark on history. The circumstances surrounding Philip's death were never fully clarified, giving rise to countless suspicions and conspiracies. Some accused the former Queen Olympias of plotting against her husband, driven by bitterness over being cast aside and an insatiable desire to secure the throne for her son. Others whispered of a crime of passion, since Pausanias, the king's assassin, had been his lover and was publicly humiliated shortly before the murder. A darker rumor still claimed that Alexander was secretly involved, feeling threatened by the existence of a new male heir, the son of Philip's recent marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice. The official investigation led by Macedonian authorities quickly concluded that Pausanias had acted alone, driven purely by personal revenge over his public humiliation. This version, convenient for Alexander and his closest allies, dismissed any suspicion of accomplices or broader internal conspiracies, and was quickly established as the final conclusion. Nevertheless, rumors of alternative versions continued to circulate among the population, keeping alive numerous theories and speculations about who was truly behind the assassination. Aware of the intrigue surrounding his rise to power, Alexander decided to act swiftly to consolidate his position. His first move was to strengthen the political alliances forged by Philip. By taking control of the League of Corinth, he reaffirmed his role as the legitimate leader of the Pan-Hellenic alliance against Persia, presenting himself as the heir to his father's legacy and the protector of Greece against the Persian threat. During his strategic absence, while he traveled to secure the support of the Greek cities, Queen Olympias seized the political vacuum to carry out a brutal plan. Using her religious influence and her status as a priestess involved in the mysterious cults of Dionysus, Olympias orchestrated a bloody purge within the Macedonian palace. The victims were none other than Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's last wife, and her young child. Cleopatra was forced to commit suicide after her child was mercilessly killed. Olympias fiercely defended her actions, claiming she was protecting Alexander's future reign by eliminating any threat to the throne and preventing the kingdom's division. When Alexander returned to the Macedonian court and learned of the massacre, he was deeply shocked and angry with his mother. Despite Olympias's justification, Alexander clearly understood that these deaths would tarnish his public image. However, faced with the harsh political reality, there was no room for hesitation or remorse. Thus, Alexander took the reins of power, determined to ensure his uncontested authority among the nobles and generals. Most of the Macedonian generals quickly swore loyalty to the young king, recognizing in him the energy and determination needed to continue Philip's expansionist plans. However, two renowned military commanders still held back: the experienced and respected General Parmenion, who commanded vast forces, and his ally Attalus, an ambitious man who had never hidden his hostility toward Alexander and Olympias. Parmenion was, at the time, the most respected and experienced of the Macedonian generals, having played a central role in Philip II's rise to power. Renowned for his exceptional strategic skills and his success in multiple military campaigns, he had led crucial battles that expanded Macedonia's borders and ensured the kingdom's military supremacy. His reputation for effective leadership, strategic caution, and loyalty to Macedonian military traditions made him a vital figure in the kingdom's political and military landscape, someone whose support could either solidify or destroy Alexander's new rule. For this reason, the new king treated the veteran general with great care. Attalus made no secret of his intent to overthrow Alexander, publicly expressing his opposition and contempt for the young king. He took advantage of existing tensions in Greece to try and stir up a rebellion, offering secret support and attempting to build alliances with the Athenians, who traditionally resented the Macedonian dominance imposed by Philip II. His objective was clear: to use Athens' prestige and power as a launchpad for a widespread insurrection against Alexander's authority. Attalus knew that a successful revolt would not only weaken the young king's position, but also pave the way for him to take a central role in Macedonia's leadership. Alexander harbored a special hatred for Attalus, never forgetting that it was this very man who had been responsible for the humiliating exile he and his mother had suffered during a turbulent period of his adolescence. Attalus, in turn, had even deeper reasons to despise Alexander, as the young king was directly associated with the brutal deaths of his daughter, Cleopatra Eurydice, and his grandchild, Philip II's legitimate heir. These tragic events left an open wound in Attalus's pride and heart, fueling his resentment as he actively spread the belief that Alexander had been the true mastermind behind Philip's assassination. His propaganda aimed to undermine Alexander's legitimacy in the eyes of the Macedonian nobles and Greek allies, portraying him as a ruthless usurper capable of any atrocity in pursuit of personal ambition. Determined to eliminate any threat to his stability, Alexander sent a trusted man, Hecatæus, accompanied by a detachment of soldiers with clear orders: bring Attalus to him, dead or alive. At the same time, Alexander was carefully negotiating with Parmenion, offering him a decisive role in the upcoming campaign against Persia. Parmenion, pragmatic and shrewd, quickly realized that his survival depended on forming a solid alliance with Alexander, and he agreed to serve under his supreme command. Attalus, isolated and betrayed by his own allies, took refuge in a city in Asia Minor, trusting that distance would protect him from Alexander's wrath. But he hadn't counted on the young king's relentless determination. The men sent by Alexander, led by Hecatæus, stealthily infiltrated the refuge where Attalus was hiding. The ambush was swift and brutal. Attalus tried to fight back, fiercely defending himself with his few remaining followers, but was soon overpowered by Alexander's seasoned soldiers. Without mercy, Hecatæus's men executed him on the spot, carrying out the king's orders to the letter. With Attalus's bloody death, Alexander had finally neutralized the last major internal threat. The brutal execution also served as a chilling warning to his enemies, making it clear what fate awaited anyone who dared to challenge or question his authority. Even so, Alexander couldn't rest. The Greek city-states, accustomed to swearing loyalty to Philip, arrogantly refused to extend their oaths to the son of the late conqueror, or submit to the young Macedonian king. Rebellion was brewing, led by the great cities that saw Philip's death as an opportunity to reclaim their lost autonomy. Caution advised Alexander to wait and consolidate his power base before confronting the rebellious Greeks. But driven by a burning desire to prove himself, the young king chose to ignore the risks and boldly marched his army south. It was more than just a military campaign. It was a symbolic statement, an open challenge to all who doubted his ability to lead. This was Alexander's first decisive step, marking the moment he began to emerge from Philip's colossal shadow. His journey toward greatness had begun, marked by blood, ambition, and an unrelenting determination to leave his own mark on history. Alexander was still in the process of consolidating his power in Macedonia when the Greek cities decided to rebel against the hegemony imposed by Philip II. Athens, Thebes, and several cities in Thessaly quickly began organizing, planning a war of liberation to regain their autonomy and expel Macedonian rule. The young king, alert to the movements of the Greek cities, reacted with remarkable speed. Alexander immediately mobilized his army and began a march southward. aiming to demand the renewal of loyalty pledges from the Greek cities. His swift action took many Greek leaders by surprise, as they hadn't expected such an efficient military response. However, the Thessalian troops, experienced and well-positioned, strategically blocked the only southern passage, located near Mount Olympus in the Vale of Tempe. Attacking such entrenched forces directly would have been extremely risky, akin to the disaster the Persians faced against the Spartans at Thermopylae, where a vastly superior force was held back by a small, well-positioned contingent in a narrow pass. Alexander, aware of that historical precedent, knew that a frontal assault could lead to devastating losses and jeopardize his campaign before it had even begun. Demonstrating remarkable strategic cunning, Alexander ordered his engineers to cut steps into the mountainside and explore old, nearly forgotten trails, guided by local inhabitants and shepherds, allowing his army to secretly bypass the Thessalians' fortified position. By the time the Thessalian forces realized what had happened, it was too late. The Macedonian army was already behind them. Realizing resistance was futile, the Thessalian troops opted for immediate surrender. Alexander used his knowledge of history to avoid repeating the mistakes of the great Xerxes, but also managed to replicate his tactical success by finding a way to circumvent the obstacle. News that Alexander had outmaneuvered one of Greece's most respected armies without shedding a single drop of blood caused shock and fear in Athens and Thebes. For the leaders of these cities, this feat demonstrated more than just military might. It revealed an unrelenting resolve. Rumors spread quickly through the streets and assemblies, fueling fears that no resistance, no matter how well planned, would be enough to stop the advance of the young Macedonian king. The fear that Alexander could easily overcome any obstacle only deepened the Greeks' sense of insecurity, speeding up their discussions about the urgent need to negotiate peace before it was too late. Soon after, the Macedonian army arrived at the gates of Thebes, a city that symbolized historic resistance to Macedonian dominance. Thebes had not yet completed its war preparations, and, recognizing its unfavorable position, sent envoys offering surrender and requesting mercy. Alexander imposed strict surrender terms on the Thebans. They were to hand over hostages, allow a permanent Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea citadel, and fully renew their oath of loyalty to the League of Corinth, pledging to supply soldiers and resources for the imminent campaign against Persia. With the Thebans' immediate acceptance of these terms, Alexander secured control of the strategic city without having to resort to direct violence. Athens, aware of the military and diplomatic power Alexander had just displayed, also chose to submit peacefully. The Athenians were deeply worried that their glorious city might suffer the same fate as other historic cities at the hands of ruthless conquerors. The fear that Alexander might destroy the city as an exemplary punishment for its rebellion loomed over its political debates. The recent memory of the harsh terms imposed on the Thebans only intensified these fears, prompting Athenian leaders to quickly opt for a cautious and peaceful submission. Thus, Alexander achieved a political and strategic victory over the Greeks, reinforcing his public image as a magnanimous and wise ruler. To formalize his victory and secure the continued support of the Greek cities, Alexander convened a new meeting of the League of Corinth. The assembly took place in an atmosphere of tension and anticipation, with representatives from the major Greek cities in attendance. During the meeting, Alexander gave a speech emphasizing the importance of Greek unity in the face of the Persian threat, and reinforcing the legitimacy of his leadership by right and military merit. After intense debate, Alexander was officially recognized as lifelong hegemon, responsible for leading all the Greeks in the planned campaign against Persia. However, the Spartans, known for their pride and independence, categorically refused to join the alliance, claiming that their traditions and freedom were incompatible with submission to an external leader. This Spartan refusal was met with displeasure by Alexander. But he chose not to press the issue at that moment, aiming to preserve the image of voluntary Greek unity under his leadership. Alexander preferred to avoid any direct conflict with the Spartans at that point, focusing instead on strengthening his position for the upcoming campaign in Asia. He firmly believed that Spartan resistance was nothing more than an empty display of pride, and that Sparta no longer had the military and economic resources to effectively challenge Macedonian power, as Sparta's former strength was now just a faded shadow of its past. He therefore considered that this isolated opposition posed no immediate threat to his plans. However, over time, the persistence and symbolism of Spartan independence would inspire future revolts among other Greek cities, forcing Alexander to realize that his initial judgment had been mistaken, and that Sparta's apparent weakness concealed a resilience capable of undermining the stability he so deeply sought. While in the heart of Greece, Alexander decided to visit the famous Oracle of Delphi to learn what the gods had in store for his future. Upon arriving at the temple, he was met with hesitation by the priests, who claimed that the Pythia was unable to offer any prophecy that day, due to unfavorable conditions dictated by the religious calendar. Impulsive and unwilling to accept refusals, Alexander completely disregarded the warning and forcefully entered the sacred precinct. Under the astonished gaze of the priests, Alexander advanced to the priestess's private chamber, firmly took her by the arm, and led her to the main altar, demanding an answer at once. Visibly upset and surprised by the young king's audacity, the Pythia, in a burst of irritation, cried out loudly, "By the gods, there is no one who can resist you!" Alexander was satisfied. He had wrung from the prophetess exactly what he wanted to hear, promptly released her, and left the temple with a triumphant smile, confident that her words guaranteed him a glorious destiny. Rumors of the incident at the Oracle of Delphi spread quickly throughout Greece, sparking intense debates and conflicting interpretations among the Greeks. Many saw the event as irrefutable proof of Alexander's predestination, believing he was directly protected by the gods and destined for great achievements. Others, however, viewed the young king's impulsive actions as a grave disrespect to religious tradition and the gods themselves, interpreting the episode as a dark omen of unchecked arrogance. Regardless of these differing opinions, the general consensus was that an extremely powerful, determined, and charismatic figure was emerging from Macedonia, one whose influence and potential would surpass even the conquests of his legendary father. After returning to Pella, Alexander threw himself wholeheartedly into preparations for the upcoming military campaign in Asia Minor. With Greece pacified and the Greek cities firmly committed to the alliance under his leadership, Alexander summoned his generals, conducted thorough inspections of the troops, and meticulously organized the supplies and resources needed for such a massive undertaking. He was determined to surpass the military and political accomplishments of Philip, raising the Macedonian legacy to heights never before seen. After consolidating his power over Greece, Alexander returned to Macedonia, and just as he was beginning preparations for his campaign against the Persians, he received alarming news that Illyrian and Thracian barbarian tribes were invading his northern territories. The history of conflict between the Macedonians and these peoples dated back centuries, marked by deep and persistent rivalry. Illyrian and Thracian tribes frequently launched swift raids into Macedonian territory, taking advantage of moments of political or military vulnerability. In response, the Macedonians conducted violent and exemplary punitive campaigns, resulting in continuous cycles of revenge and hostility. This age-old rivalry had become an integral part of Macedonian military culture, fueling constant vigilance along the kingdom's borders. With the ambitious Persian campaign on the horizon, Alexander quickly realized he couldn't risk confronting the vast Persian Empire without first securing his rear. It was essential to make a decisive show of strength to discourage any future incursions while he was away. Alexander then organized a major military campaign to the northern lands. Rapidly mobilizing his forces and making detailed preparations, he showed exceptional skill in logistics and strategy. He gathered his father Philip II's veteran troops and young soldiers eager to prove their worth. Beyond the immediate military goal of repelling the barbarian invasions, this expedition would serve as a crucial test of Alexander's leadership and abilities in real combat. Success in this campaign would confirm his standing as an effective military commander to his army and reinforce his authority and morale among the troops, vital for the even more ambitious campaigns against the Persian Empire. The battles to repel the barbarians were swift and decisive, marked by the Macedonian troops' remarkable organization and discipline under Alexander's direct command. At first, the Illyrians tried to use the rugged terrain of their homeland to their defensive advantage, staging ambushes and surprise attacks against the invading forces. However, the Macedonians' superior strategy, combined with Alexander's inspiring leadership on the battlefield, quickly broke through these improvised defenses. In just a few clashes, the invaders were soundly defeated, forced to retreat chaotically back to their own lands, leaving behind many dead, prisoners, and military equipment. The young king, however, wasn't satisfied with merely repelling the invaders. Determined to impose an exemplary punishment to secure lasting peace, Alexander decided to push even further north, into lands inhabited by barbarian tribes beyond the legendary Danube River. The Danube held particular weight in the Hellenic imagination, often appearing in Greek myths and legends as a mysterious boundary between the civilized world and the wild barbarian domain. It was seen as a near mystical limit, beyond which lay unknown dangers and untamed peoples. By making the bold decision to cross the Danube, Alexander was not only facing a significant military challenge, but also breaking through deeply rooted psychological and cultural barriers. This action clearly symbolized his determination to surpass ancient limits, projecting an even more powerful and heroic image to his troops and allies. To carry out this unprecedented crossing, Alexander called upon his renowned corps of military engineers, experts known for their ability to overcome natural obstacles. Using advanced techniques for the time, they built floating bridges and sturdy wooden structures that withstood the Danube's strong currents. The Macedonian army crossed safely and swiftly, watching in awe the efficiency and precision of their engineers. On the other side of the river lived the Getae, a proud warrior people who traditionally considered themselves protected by the Danube's natural barrier. Accustomed to the security offered by the river's difficult passage, they had built no proper fortifications to defend their lands against a swift and efficient incursion. When they realized that the Macedonian army, with its well-trained troops and superior equipment, had managed to cross what had, until then, seemed an impenetrable barrier, the Getae fell into shock and confusion. Local leaders scrambled to rally their forces and organize a defense, but the surprise and fear had already taken deep root among the barbarian warriors, significantly weakening their ability to resist. Despite desperate initial resistance, with violent battles and fierce hand-to-hand fighting, the barbarian defenses were quickly overcome by the discipline and military effectiveness of the Macedonian forces. Alexander personally led some of these battles, displaying courage and ferocity that deeply inspired his soldiers. After decisive victories, Alexander ordered ruthless plundering and the complete destruction of several barbarian villages. Macedonian soldiers set fire to homes and granaries, while prisoners were taken and property was looted without mercy. Alexander made sure the punishment was exemplary and devastating, sending an unequivocal message to all the tribes in the region. Any aggression against Macedonia would result in brutal, merciless consequences. Faced with the overwhelming Macedonian strength and the inevitability of total defeat, tribal leaders, driven by desperation and pragmatism, quickly sent envoys to negotiate peace terms with Alexander. These negotiations, though scarcely recorded, certainly included harsh conditions imposed by Alexander. Among them was the requirement that the barbarian tribes supply contingents of skilled warriors to join the Macedonian ranks in future military campaigns in Asia. Illyrian and Thracian fighters were renowned for their exceptional ferocity in battle, especially in hand-to-hand combat and swift ambushes on rough terrain. Specializing in guerrilla tactics, these warriors were known for their remarkable physical endurance, bravery in extreme adversity, and mastery of weapons like short swords, spears, and small shields, granting them great mobility and effectiveness in sudden attacks. Incorporated into the Macedonian army, they played important roles as auxiliary troops and advanced reconnaissance units, further strengthening the operational capacity and versatility of Alexander's forces. This commitment to supply troops to the Macedonians reinforced Alexander's military power and established a new policy of strategic integration. Under this policy, conquered peoples were directly incorporated into the Macedonian army. This allowed for the quick replenishment of battlefield losses and helped forge bonds of loyalty with tribal chieftains, who benefited from generous shares of war spoils, reducing the likelihood of future rebellions or betrayals. Alexander's campaign in the barbarian lands was a resounding success, further cementing his reputation as a bold leader. However, while he was still leading troops in the north, a rumor quickly spread through Greece, claiming that Alexander had died in a violent ambush organized by the barbarians. According to the rumors, Alexander had fallen in battle after heroically resisting alongside his men. The consequences of this rumor were immediate and devastating. Several Greek cities, believing the powerful Macedonian king was truly gone, began planning revolts to reclaim their lost autonomy. The false report spread especially in Thebes, which saw in the supposed death of the young king the perfect opportunity to finally free itself from Macedonian rule. Still on his way back to Macedonia, Alexander received the news of the new Greek revolt with deep outrage and fury. He felt betrayed and was intensely angered by the persistence of these uprisings, especially from Thebes, a city that had already rebelled several times and was now betraying him again, despite the mercy he had shown in their last confrontation. Alexander saw this betrayal as intolerable. He decided that the Theban rebels would face an exemplary and final punishment. The young king was determined not only to restore Macedonian control, but also to send a clear and powerful message that would discourage future revolts and ensure lasting stability during his upcoming campaign in Asia. The stubborn Thebans would feel the full wrath of the Macedonian king in what would become one of the most brutal and violent episodes in Alexander's history. After a false rumor spread rapidly across Greece claiming that Alexander had died during his campaign against the barbarians north of the Danube River, the political climate became unstable and ripe for new rebellions. Thebes, a historic city famous for its glorious military past, saw in this rumor an ideal opportunity to reclaim its lost independence. Thebes was a city steeped in history, with a glorious past deeply rooted in Greek mythology. Considered the birthplace of legendary heroes like Heracles, Cadmus, and the tragic Oedipus, Thebes held a special place in Hellenic culture. Its military importance had been cemented after the Peloponnesian War, when Thebes, under the brilliant leadership of generals Epaminondas and Pelopidas, managed to end Spartan military supremacy in the decisive Battle of Leuctra. During that period, Thebes emerged as Greece's dominant military power until its defeat at Chaeronea by Philip II. However, despite that setback, the warrior spirit and memory of its past glories remained alive among the Thebans, driving them once again to pursue freedom. One of the key figures behind this rebellion was the Athenian Demosthenes, an influential orator and politician who harbored deep hostility toward Macedonian hegemony. Demosthenes actively promoted the revolt, using his political prestige and rhetorical skill to persuade other Greek cities to support the Theban cause. Driven by a desire to restore Athenian supremacy, Demosthenes presented the Athenian people with false reports of Alexander's death, further fueling their enthusiasm. The Persian Empire also played a key role in supplying large amounts of money and logistical resources to the Thebans, repeating a controversial alliance that had previously occurred during the Persian Wars. At that time, Thebes had allied with the invading Persians against their fellow Greeks, something widely regarded as a great disgrace in Theban history. Now, by once again accepting Persian gold to fund their resistance against the Macedonians, the Thebans were repeating a historic mistake, drawing criticism and deepening the negative perception of their stance among the Greek cities. Although many Greeks harbored resentment toward the Macedonians, the city of Sparta chose a cautious and neutral approach. Despite deeply hating Macedonia, the Spartans decided not to intervene directly. With the Thebans on the front line of resistance against the Macedonians, the Spartans preferred to remain in a defensive position at the Isthmus of Corinth, awaiting further developments. Upon learning of the Theban uprising, Alexander became furious. Returning from Thrace, he led his army toward Thebes, understanding that a swift response was critical to prevent other Greek cities from joining the revolt. The Macedonian army reached Thebes with extraordinary speed, even before the Thebans had fully grasped the looming threat. Hoping to avoid unnecessary strain on his troops, Alexander initially offered generous terms for surrender, demanding only that the leaders of the rebellion be handed over, sparing the city and its people. However, the Thebans vehemently rejected the offer, proclaiming from their walls that any Greek city opposed to Macedonian tyranny would be welcomed to fight by their side. Alexander's patience ran out when he realized the Thebans were using Persian military equipment, including scorpions and catapults. Outraged by this blatant betrayal, Alexander concluded that such an affront could not be tolerated. The Thebans' use of Persian weaponry was not only a personal insult, but also proof that the Persian plan to sow internal divisions among the Greeks was producing dangerous results. Determined to send an unequivocal message to the rest of the Greek cities, Alexander resolved to punish Thebes in an exemplary and merciless manner. During the siege of Thebes, Alexander demonstrated his strategic brilliance by carefully dividing his army into 3 distinct columns. The first column advanced directly against the Theban fortifications, launching a strong frontal assault to test the strength of the defenses. As the first wave of attackers began to lose momentum and show signs of exhaustion, a second column immediately took over the assault, maintaining relentless pressure on the defenders and allowing them no time to rest or regroup. The third column, composed of fresh troops and experienced veterans, stood ready to charge at the decisive moment, ensuring the Theban resistance would gradually be worn down. Simultaneously, the Macedonian garrison at the Cadmea citadel played a crucial role. These Macedonian soldiers, stationed in Thebes since the last peace treaty and now surrounded by the Thebans during the siege, patiently awaited an opportunity to act. At the critical moment of the battle, strategically coordinated with the external assault, they launched a surprise attack from inside the city, breaking through the Theban defensive lines and causing widespread panic and disarray among the defenders. This perfect combination of simultaneous attacks from outside and within the city was decisive in completely collapsing Thebes' military organization, thereby securing Macedonian victory. Facing the imminent threat, the Thebans freed and armed their slaves, a desperate move to strengthen the city's defense. Despite their fierce resistance, the defenders of Thebes could not withstand the numerical and strategic superiority of the Macedonian army. After overcoming the opposition, Alexander's forces carried out a ruthless massacre. All public buildings and private homes were systematically demolished, symbolizing absolute power and the exemplary punishment imposed by the Macedonians. The soldiers, fueled by accumulated hatred and a thirst for revenge after the brutal battle, showed no mercy, not even in the face of desperate pleas from the defenseless population. Approximately 6,000 Thebans were killed in the initial massacre, while around 30,000 survivors were captured and sold into slavery throughout the markets of Greece. The sheer scale of this brutality not only deeply shocked the Greek world, but also set a grim precedent for the consequences of defying Alexander and Macedonian rule. News of the devastation had immediate consequences in other Greek cities. Several cities quickly sent envoys with offers of submission, and even the heads of rebellious leaders to avoid a similar fate. Athens, in particular, rushed to send representatives to negotiate, initially facing Alexander's harsh demand for the surrender of Demosthenes and other agitators. After intense negotiations, Alexander agreed to reduce his demands, accepting only the exile of one of the main rebel leaders. The Theban episode firmly cemented the fear and authority commanded by the young Macedonian king among the Greek cities. Despite the widespread moral condemnation that the brutality provoked, Alexander had drawn a clear line against future uprisings. With Greece pacified, Alexander turned back to the final preparations for his military campaign in Asia Minor. The resources and soldiers acquired after Thebes' fall further strengthened his military capabilities. Years later, in 315 BC, Thebes was partially rebuilt with the support of Greek cities like Athens, but it never fully regained its former glory. The destruction caused by Alexander remained a grim reminder of the devastating consequences of defying Macedonian power. Determined to surpass the conquests of his father, Philip II, Alexander was now fully prepared to begin his legendary campaign in Asia Minor. After pacifying Greece and reinforcing the borders of the Macedonian kingdom, Alexander finally turned his focus to the goal he had dreamed of since his youth: the invasion of Asia and the conquest of the mighty Persian Empire. His army, now assembled in Pella, buzzed with excitement and anticipation for the great adventure about to begin. Alexander left Macedonia under the rule of the experienced general Antipater, a highly respected Macedonian commander and statesman who had served faithfully and competently during the reign of Philip II. Renowned for his strategic skill, political wisdom, and firm leadership, Antipater was seen as the ideal choice to govern Macedonia in Alexander's absence. He was entrusted with the crucial mission of maintaining internal stability, repelling any invasions, and suppressing revolts that might threaten the kingdom's security and integrity during the young king's prolonged absence. Before his departure, many advisors urged Alexander to marry and produce a legitimate heir to secure the succession of the Macedonian throne and prevent future succession crises. This concern was well-founded, given the high risk of instability that could arise if Alexander were killed or incapacitated during his military campaign. The absence of a clear heir could trigger fierce disputes among the Macedonian nobles and generals, potentially plunging the kingdom into civil war and political fragmentation. Dynastic continuity was essential not only to preserve internal order, but also to ensure that conquered territories remained under Macedonian control, safe from internal uprisings or external invasions. However, Alexander, impatient and driven by a sense of urgency, categorically refused. He firmly believed that the time to act was now, and that success in his Asian campaign would naturally solidify his position and resolve the succession issue over time. Ignoring his advisors' cautious concerns and completely consumed by his desire to conquer and immortalize his name, he decided to set off immediately with his army toward Asia, implicitly accepting the risks of not having a legitimate heir to the throne. On the other side of the Hellespont stretched the vast and opulent Persian Empire, a superpower that held economic and military dominance from Asia Minor to India. With its capital in Persepolis, the Persian Empire controlled a massive territory inhabited by diverse peoples and cultures, all of whom paid regular tribute to the Persian crown, ensuring its almost limitless wealth. Its armies were composed of diverse contingents, including fearsome archers, specialized cavalry, and elite troops known as the Immortals. Moreover, its extensive network of roads and outposts enabled rapid troop mobilization and effective communication throughout the empire, making it a formidable opponent for any invader. Though still immensely powerful, the Persian Empire was facing a critical moment of internal vulnerability. Frequent power struggles among the nobility and the royal family had created deep divisions within the Persian court, weakening the empire's political cohesion. Ongoing palace conspiracies bred an atmosphere of paranoia and widespread distrust among military and political leaders, undermining the effectiveness of strategic decision-making. In addition, local rebellions frequently erupted in provinces like Egypt and Babylon, draining essential resources and dispersing forces that could otherwise defend the empire from outside threats. These combined factors made the Persian Empire vulnerable to invasion and presented Alexander with a remarkable opportunity to exploit and further destabilize a seemingly invincible enemy. The Macedonian army, meticulously trained and refined over the years by Philip II, was a formidable military force. The disciplined and well-armed Macedonian phalangites formed the core of this army. Alongside them stood the cavalry, comprising Macedonian horsemen and the renowned Thessalian riders, known for their superior battlefield skills. Additionally, Balkan contingents and Greek auxiliary troops, who saw this campaign as a chance for wealth and glory, completed Alexander's force. Though powerful, the Kingdom of Macedonia had limited resources to support a prolonged campaign. This imposed immediate pressure on Alexander. The Asia campaign had to be swift, efficient, and above all, profitable from the start to secure the supplies and resources needed for the Macedonian army's advance. Upon crossing into Asia via the Hellespont, Alexander immediately took center stage. His ship was the first to land on Persian soil. In a symbolic gesture, he hurled his spear from the ship onto the shore, watching it embed itself firmly in the sand. That act, heavy with meaning and witnessed by his army, proclaimed his claim to these new lands. Near the landing site lay the ruins of the legendary city of Troy. Deeply influenced by mythology and the epic tales of Homer, Alexander ordered several sacrifices to the gods, especially in honor of Achilles and Patroclus, the great heroes of the Trojan War. Amid the ceremonies, local priests led him to the tombs of the ancient Greek warriors, granting him a symbolic encounter with his legendary idols. The young king was especially moved before the tomb of Achilles, the hero who had been his greatest role model since childhood. There, at the resting place of the legendary warrior, Alexander made silent vows to surpass the deeds of the great Greek hero, determined to leave an everlasting mark on history. During his stay near Troy, priests presented him with supposed relics of the ancient heroes. Although Alexander doubted their authenticity, he chose to distribute them among his most distinguished officers and soldiers. This was a shrewd move, as it immediately boosted troop morale and reinforced the heroic image of the campaign. Officers proudly displayed these artifacts on the battlefield, feeling protected and blessed by the ancient gods. Meanwhile, word of Macedonians' imminent arrival spread rapidly through the Persian provinces of Asia Minor. At first, King Darius III of Persia underestimated the threat, but he soon realized he was facing a serious challenge. Persian generals, aware of the Macedonians' strength and efficiency, quickly began mobilizing troops to confront Alexander, recognizing the gravity of the threat. Military units were summoned from nearby regions to reinforce defenses in Asia Minor. Additionally, local leaders were given explicit orders to prepare fortifications and strengthen the garrisons of strategic cities along the main Macedonian routes. The Persians also attempted to recruit Greek mercenaries and experienced soldiers from distant regions, using their wealth to rapidly bolster their ranks. Despite internal tensions, Persian military commanders tried to present a united and solid front before their troops, knowing that soldier morale and strategic cohesion would be crucial to defeating the army led by the young Macedonian king. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, located along the western coast, had lived for decades under Persian domination, though they had strongly preserved their Greek culture and traditions. These cities, such as Ephesus, Miletus, and Halicarnassus, were important centers of commerce and culture, yet they were under the authority of Persian satraps, paid heavy tributes, and supplied troops to the Persian imperial army. However, Persian rule was often seen by the local Greeks as oppressive tyranny, fueling resentment and a latent desire for independence. Alexander counted on this very sentiment to quickly gain the support of these cities, offering them liberation from Persian rule and an honorable place within his growing empire. Aware of the need to act fast, Alexander began preparing his army to advance on the Greek cities still under Persian control. For him, it was essential to liberate these cities swiftly, gaining allies and securing valuable resources to sustain his campaign deep into the heart of the Persian Empire. Now, with his army fully prepared and driven by the promise of eternal glory and boundless riches, Alexander set out into the interior of Asia Minor, determined to face and defeat the Persians, embarking on a campaign that would shape his destiny and irrevocably alter the course of history. Alexander was advancing through Asia Minor, determined to liberate the Greek cities and directly challenge the vast power of the Persian Empire. Near the legendary city of Troy, where he had paid tribute to the ancient Greek heroes, his army was preparing for the first major military test of the campaign. On the banks of the Granicus River, the opposing armies stood face to face, carefully assessing one another. The river, though neither wide nor deep, posed a significant tactical challenge, as any attempt to cross it would expose the attacking troops to concentrated fire from defenders on the opposite bank, leaving them vulnerable and disorganized. The Macedonian army consisted of approximately 30,000 infantry soldiers, highly disciplined and arranged in tight phalanx formations, and about 5,000 cavalry, including the famous companion cavalry personally led by Alexander. On the other side, the Persian army, superior in number, exceeded 40,000 men, composed of various troops from different regions of the vast Persian Empire. Notable among them was the Greek general Memnon of Rhodes, commander of a significant contingent of Greek mercenaries, experienced men skilled in the art of war. On the eve of the battle, Parmenion, the veteran general and trusted advisor to Alexander, urged caution, advising the young king to wait for a more opportune moment to attack. Alexander listened patiently to the advice, but firmly decided against it, fearing that hesitation might allow the arrival of Persian reinforcements and further complicate his plans. The night before the battle, Alexander gathered his generals for an intense strategic discussion. Under the flickering torchlight, Parmenion repeated his concern about an immediate river crossing, emphasizing the risk of disorganization and vulnerability of the troops in the face of the enemy. Other generals partially agreed, suggesting alternative tactics, such as a diversionary maneuver to lure the Persians, or waiting for a better opportunity. Alexander listened carefully to each argument but remained resolute. He outlined a bold plan for the next morning. The companion cavalry, under his personal command, would quickly cross on the right flank, while the center launched a simultaneous attack to distract the Persian forces. Even in the face of his officers' initial doubts, Alexander expressed total confidence in the plan's execution, insisting that speed and surprise would be key to victory. Meanwhile, the Persian high command evaluated the situation with confidence, but also subtle apprehension. Although their generals were aware of Alexander's growing reputation and the efficiency of the Macedonian army, they held an almost absolute belief in victory due to their numerical superiority and the tactical advantage of holding a defensive position behind the river, especially as time was on their side, with reinforcements en route. Many Persian officers genuinely believed that the overwhelming strength of their troops, combined with the seasoned leadership of generals like Memnon of Rhodes and his Greek mercenary contingent, would be more than enough to halt the Macedonian advance. The Greek mercenaries, in turn, felt the pressure of battle weighing on them even more heavily, knowing that their performance could determine not only the outcome of this clash, but also their future reputations on the battlefield. The next day, to the piercing sound of trumpets, the attack began. The companion cavalry, led directly by Alexander, advanced on the right, immediately facing fierce resistance as they crossed the turbulent waters of the Granicus. In the center, light infantry and part of the cavalry advanced in a coordinated push, but quickly encountered a fierce barrage of arrows, javelins, and projectiles hurled by the Persians, resulting in considerable losses. The crossing of the Granicus River revealed countless acts of heroism and sacrifice among the Macedonian soldiers. As they advanced under the intense rain of Persian arrows and missiles, many soldiers showed extraordinary bravery, protecting their comrades and holding formation, even in the face of heavy casualties. There were reports of wounded soldiers who continued to fight valiantly, inspiring those around them. One young officer, mortally wounded, refused to be carried off the battlefield until his unit had safely reached the opposite bank. One common soldier, seeing his commander struck down, risked his life to carry him to safety, only to be fatally struck while saving his comrade. Despite the initial casualties, the simultaneous advance of the Macedonian troops through the center fulfilled its strategic goal by distracting the Persians and allowing Alexander's cavalry to complete the crossing successfully. Alexander quickly regrouped his cavalry on the far bank and led a devastating flank attack on the Persian forces, catching them completely off guard. In the chaos of the fierce cavalry battle, Alexander displayed extraordinary courage, personally taking extreme risks and leading by example. He quickly spotted Mithridates, a renowned Persian general and son-in-law of King Darius III himself, skillfully commanding Persian cavalry at that critical point in the fight. Without hesitation, Alexander charged, directly engaging the enemy general in a violent duel. The combat was brief, with both men displaying exceptional martial skill, but it was Alexander's precision that triumphed. With a swift and powerful blow, the young Macedonian king struck a fatal hit on Mithridates, felling him in front of the Persian troops and sending a wave of shock and terror through the enemy lines, deeply shaking the morale and cohesion of nearby units. Shortly after, the Persian officer Rhasaces, enraged by Mithridates' death, charged furiously at Alexander with clear intent for revenge. Taking advantage of the moment as Alexander was regaining his balance after the previous duel, Rhasaces delivered a powerful strike aimed directly at the young king's head. However, Alexander's sturdy bronze helmet absorbed the brutal impact, saving his life by a thread. Displaying lightning-fast reflexes and exceptional swordsmanship, Alexander immediately countered with a precise sword strike, landing a deadly blow on Rhasakes and eliminating another Persian commander. The situation remained extremely dangerous for Alexander, who, amid the intense heat of battle, didn't notice the stealthy approach of Spithridates, a Persian commander determined to assassinate the Macedonian leader. Spithridates closed in quickly from behind, sword raised for a killing blow. At the last second, while Alexander was still distracted by the fighting around him, Cletus, one of his loyal and experienced bodyguards, spotted the imminent threat. With extraordinary agility and no hesitation, Cletus lunged forward and landed a powerful sword strike, severing Spithridates' right arm. The Persian let out a cry of pain and fell from his horse. That fearless act saved Alexander's life from certain death. This episode further boosted the morale of the Macedonian troops, who seized the moment of chaos to complete the river crossing and launch a massive frontal assault on the Persian army. The Persians quickly descended into total disarray, leading to a frantic and desperate retreat. The Greek mercenaries under Memnon, seeing the collapse of the Persian forces, tried to regroup quickly in a solid defensive position, aware that the situation had become dire. Forming a tight formation, they created a defensive barrier with shields and spears, trying to protect one another from the rapidly approaching Macedonian assault. Realizing that resistance would be useless against the superior Macedonian force, Memnon's men sent envoys to negotiate terms of surrender, hoping to avoid a massacre. However, Alexander categorically rejected their offers, determined to send a clear and unambiguous message to all Greeks considering fighting alongside the Persians. Treason would not be tolerated, and there would be serious consequences. This ruthless rejection of terms intensified the panic among the Greek mercenaries, setting the stage for a decisive and brutal Macedonian attack. The Macedonians launched an unrelenting assault, resulting in devastating losses for the Greek mercenaries. Their desperate resistance quickly collapsed under the numerical and tactical superiority of Alexander's troops. In the chaos of battle, many were killed in fierce and merciless combat, while others desperately tried to surrender without success. Commander Memnon managed to escape and would continue to lead Persian resistance against the Macedonian invaders in future engagements. But on that day, the victory was spectacular, with minimal Macedonian losses, further cementing the fame and prestige of the young king. Alexander was greeted with fervent cheers from his soldiers, hailed as a true hero on the battlefield. This was the Macedonians' first major victory against the Persians in the campaign. However, Alexander knew full well that this victory was only the beginning of a long and challenging war against the mighty Persian Empire. The battle at the Granicus River had secured his initial hold on Asia Minor, but much more remained to be conquered. After the decisive victory on the banks of the Granicus River, Alexander firmly established his control over Asia Minor, taking possession of vast territories that had once belonged to the Persian Empire. The magnitude of this achievement did not go unnoticed by the local populations, who closely observed every move of the young Macedonian king. To consolidate his rule and project an image of continuity and stability, Alexander appointed the officer Callus as satrap of the region. The title of satrap had traditionally been used by the Persians to designate governors with broad administrative and military powers. By adopting this Persian administrative practice, Alexander intended to send a clear message that his conquest did not mean the destruction of existing structures, but rather the peaceful integration of these cities into his growing empire. Alexander's political strategy met with relative success. Many cities that had initially hesitated or remained loyal to Persian rule began opening their gates to the Macedonian army, choosing a peaceful transition instead of armed resistance. During his journey through Asia Minor, Alexander arrived in Ephesus, one of the richest and most culturally important cities in the region. there stood the Grand Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. However, the temple had been destroyed by fire on the very day Alexander was born. Macedonian legends claimed that the goddess Artemis had turned her attention away in order to witness the birth of the man who would become the greatest conqueror of his age. Deeply moved by this tale and filled with sincere gratitude toward the goddess, Alexander publicly pledged to rebuild the temple, an act that further strengthened his acceptance among the local inhabitants. While most cities submitted peacefully, Miletus chose the path of armed resistance. The city's strategic location, with a highly defensible port that was vital to Persian naval operations, posed a direct threat to the future success of Alexander's campaign. If Miletus remained under Persian control, it could be used to launch surprise naval attacks along the entire coast of Asia Minor, placing the Macedonian army's supply lines and communications under constant threat. Understanding the strategic urgency of capturing Miletus, Alexander ordered the immediate siege of the city. Miletus resisted bravely, with determined and well-trained defenders, including a strong garrison of Greek mercenaries. These defenders, motivated by news of the earlier massacre of Greek mercenaries at the Battle of the Granicus, were prepared to fight to the end. To ensure the success of the siege and prevent Miletus from receiving reinforcements and supplies by sea, Alexander imposed a strict naval blockade on the city's harbor. Using his limited but strategically positioned fleet, the Macedonians tirelessly patrolled the waters around Miletus, intercepting any ships that tried to break the blockade. This measure effectively cut off Persian reinforcements and essential supplies, gradually weakening the city's defenses and playing a decisive role in its eventual fall. After intense days of siege, the Macedonians finally breached the city walls. The invasion was swift and effective, catching the defenders off guard and quickly breaking their organized resistance. Inside the city, the Greek mercenaries prepared for a desperate last stand, fully aware of the brutal fate suffered by their comrades in the previous battle. However, this time Alexander surprised everyone by taking an unexpectedly magnanimous stance. He offered generous terms to the Greek mercenaries, promising to spare their lives if they agreed to join his forces in the campaign against the Persians. Seeing a unique opportunity to survive and continue their military careers, the mercenaries readily accepted the conditions offered by Alexander. In another calculated move to ensure the goodwill of local cities, Alexander forbade his troops from looting Miletus, sparing the city and its inhabitants from further suffering. In exchange, he requested only a reasonable indemnity to cover the costs of the siege, a gesture that reinforced his reputation as a fair and merciful leader. Alexander's next strategic target was the important port city of Halicarnassus. This fortified city played a crucial role in maintaining Macedonian control over the coast of Asia Minor, and was vital to weakening Persian naval influence in the Aegean Sea. Alexander's main opponent in this battle was Memnon of Rhodes, an exceptionally talented Greek mercenary in the service of Persia. Memnon showed impressive strategic skill, organizing fierce resistance to the Macedonian siege, forcing Alexander to employ advanced and innovative siege technologies, including mobile towers, catapults, battering rams, and ballistae. The fighting in Halicarnassus was intense and bloody, raging through the streets and alleys of the city itself. Greek mercenaries defended the city with fierce determination, which led to a dramatic and singular confrontation between Greeks fighting on opposing sides. When the defenders saw defeat looming, they chose to set fire to much of the city, denying Alexander a fully intact victory and forcing him to capture a partially ruined city. Although defeated, Memnon managed to escape by sea, remaining a dangerous adversary. He continued to plan future attacks on Alexander's rear, showing that the campaign in Asia was far from over. Despite these land victories, the powerful Persian navy still posed a constant threat to Macedonian military operations. Aware of the limitations of his own naval power, Alexander made the difficult strategic decision to abandon immediate control of the Aegean Sea and concentrate all military efforts on land campaigns. However, to neutralize the Persian naval threat and secure his rear, Alexander devised a comprehensive plan to systematically conquer every coastal city along the Mediterranean, from Troy to Egypt. By doing so, he would ensure that no port could be used by the Persians as a naval base, effectively protecting his supply lines and allowing him to advance safely toward the heart of the Persian Empire. During this campaign, Alexander arrived in the city of Gordian, known throughout the region for its ancient and intriguing local prophecy. This prophecy claimed that the future ruler of all Asia would come to the city riding a humble ox cart. Its fulfillment occurred when the peasant Gordius entered the city in such a cart and was crowned king. In gratitude to Zeus for his unexpected rise, Gordius tied the cart to the temple of the supreme god with a complex knot, vowing that his descendants would rule as long as the knot remained intact. Generations later, with the Gordian line extinct, a new prophecy emerged declaring that whoever untied the knot would rule the world. Many had tried in vain to solve the knot's puzzle, until Alexander, aware of the prophecy and its importance, decided to take on the challenge. Alexander deeply understood the symbolic weight this challenge held for strengthening the Macedonian collective imagination. By confronting and solving the riddle of the Gordian knot, he would reinforce the belief that his people were destined to achieve extraordinary conquests and widespread domination of the known world. This act would further boost the morale of his troops and solidify his image as a leader chosen by the gods, feeding the confidence and determination driving his campaign. After carefully studying the intricate weave of the knot, Alexander paused for a moment, feeling the weight of expectation from those watching his every move. With a determined expression, he drew his sword. In a bold and confident gesture, he sliced the knot in two. This act not only solved the riddle, but also sent a powerful message to all present, reinforcing his image as a practical, daring, and relentless leader when faced with seemingly unsolvable challenges. It demonstrated his belief that problems which appear impossible can be overcome with determination, creativity, and the courage to take paths others wouldn't dare. After the stunning victory at the Granicus River and the establishment of his initial control over Asia Minor, Alexander advanced with determination, ready to face the mighty Persian imperial army. On the other side, however, King Darius III was equally determined to halt the advance of the young Macedonian conqueror and protect the legacy and prestige of his vast empire. A decisive clash that would shape the future of two great civilizations was about to unfold. The site chosen for this crucial encounter was near the city of Issus, strategically located on the southeastern coast of Asia Minor, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Amidst Mountains. The region was a narrow coastal plain, hemmed in by mountains to the east and the sea to the west, creating a confined battlefield that limited wide maneuvers, ideal for Alexander's more compact, agile, and disciplined army. The terrain favored Macedonian tactics, allowing Alexander to control movement and prevent the Persians from fully leveraging their numerical superiority and the sweeping maneuvers of the powerful Achaemenid cavalry. Moreover, the proximity to the sea made it harder for defeated troops to flee, heightening the psychological stakes of the battle and giving it an even more decisive and deadly aura. Aware of the Persian numerical superiority, Alexander carefully devised his strategic approach. He positioned his heavy infantry, organized in Macedonian phalanxes, at the center of the formation, flanked by cavalry commanded by himself and his most trusted officers, such as Parmenion. Alexander also deployed light units and archers on the flanks to provide protection and greater flexibility in combat. Darius III arranged his troops with equal care, aiming to maximize his numerical superiority and exploit the diversity and specialization of his forces. The center of his formation was occupied by heavy infantry, composed mainly of experienced Greek mercenaries considered highly effective in close combat. On the wings were large contingents of the renowned Persian cavalry, whose speed and skill could quickly outflank and overpower the enemy. The Persian archers, famed for their accuracy and sheer volume of fire, were positioned just behind the infantry to inflict heavy losses on the Macedonians even before the main clash. Although imposing and numerically superior, the vast formation of the Persian troops made quick maneuvers and efficient communication difficult, leaving them vulnerable to concentrated and rapid Macedonian strikes. The Persian army under Darius III's command was significantly larger, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to 120,000 troops. In contrast, Alexander's Macedonian army numbered around 40,000 soldiers, including the disciplined and fearsome Macedonian phalanx, the agile and well-trained companion cavalry, specialized archers, and auxiliary troops. The more compact and disciplined disposition of the Macedonian forces allowed for swift and effective communication during battle, offsetting their numerical disadvantage with strategic and tactical superiority. Following an ancient Persian tradition, Darius brought with him to the military camp his mother, wife, and daughters, symbolically reinforcing his absolute commitment to victory and the survival of the empire. The presence of the Persian royal family had a profound emotional impact on the troops, highlighting the broader meaning of the battle and reminding every soldier they were fighting for the continuity and dignity of their civilization. Before the decisive battle at Issus, Alexander gathered his men in a display of powerful, charismatic leadership. With a firm and clear voice, he addressed his troops directly, stressing the historical importance of the confrontation and reminding them of the victories they had shared. Alexander emphasized they were fighting not just for glory or material gain, but for honor, freedom, and the legacy they would leave to future generations. He promised generous rewards, eternal recognition, and the respect of posterity, assuring them that the courage shown that day would echo through history. His words ignited their spirits and deeply strengthened their resolve, preparing them to fully face the Persian forces led by Darius. At dawn, the two armies were in position, facing one another across the narrow field near Issus. The Persian troops, confident in their numerical superiority, advanced first, aiming to quickly exploit their advantage. As at the Battle of the Granicus, a stream separated the two armies. This watercourse, known as the Pinaris, was about 5 to 15 meters wide in that sector, and roughly half a meter deep at its shallowest point. On Alexander's side, a slight elevation gave a defensive advantage and made it harder for Persian cavalry to charge. Darius ordered a massive opening barrage by his archers, unleashing a deadly storm of arrows aimed at weakening the Macedonian lines before the main clash. Anticipating this tactic, Alexander had positioned his troops in tight formation, protected by their shields and the compact structure of the phalanx, minimizing casualties from the projectile storm. The Persian infantry then advanced, placing the stream behind them. Alexander quickly seized the brief lull after the archers' assault to order his heavy infantry to advance, putting pressure on the enemy center. Simultaneously, he personally led a bold push by the companion cavalry on the right flank. On the left flank, the clash between Persian and Macedonian cavalry was fierce. The Persian cavalry, known for its exceptional mobility and quick maneuvers, attempted to encircle and disrupt the Macedonian horsemen led by General Parmenion. Parmenion faced the difficult task of holding off the Persian elite cavalry, buying time for Alexander to strike the enemy's left without having to worry about a counterattack. The companion unit, under Alexander's direct and inspiring leadership, showed unmatched discipline, superior skill, and relentless courage. The Macedonian cavalry's ability to maintain tight formations and execute coordinated attacks inflicted serious damage on the Persian auxiliary units protecting the right flank. This partial cavalry victory proved crucial in shifting the course of the battle, enabling Alexander to launch his decisive assault directly at the central positions where Darius III was stationed. While Parmenion struggled to hold the Persian cavalry at bay, and Alexander fought on the right, Darius was pressing hard against the center of the Macedonian infantry line, unaware he was walking into a trap, with Alexander preparing to strike the final blow. In the heat of battle, Alexander spotted a unique opportunity. He located the position from which Darius was commanding, protected by his royal guard. Driven by fierce determination, Alexander gathered an elite contingent of horsemen and led a swift, direct assault on the Persian royal position. The Macedonian charge was relentless and fast, catching Darius's royal guards off guard and spreading panic among their ranks. Though well guarded, Darius was deeply shaken by the boldness and proximity of the attack. Facing mounting pressure and a real threat to his life, Darius decided to flee to a safer location. His quick escape in a chariot was witnessed by the Persian troops and had a devastating effect on their morale. This decisive moment turned the tide of the battle, severely weakening Persian resistance, now being attacked from the rear, and boosting the morale of the Macedonian troops, who saw in Alexander's bravery a clear confirmation of his exceptional, divinely ordained leadership. The Persian troops initially tried to hold their ground after their leader's retreat, but their line quickly began to collapse as soldiers fled for their lives. Realizing his forces were unraveling and the battle was lost, Darius faced a critical and dramatic decision. Initially confident in his superiority, the Persian king became deeply alarmed as Alexander closed in with his personal cavalry. Fearing capture or death, Darius was urged by his generals to abandon the battlefield. The sight of their supreme leader fleeing triggered immediate chaos, turning a structured retreat into a panicked rout. Many soldiers, leaderless and mentally shattered, threw down their weapons and tried to flee, becoming easy targets for the Macedonian troops. Darius managed to escape to fight another day, but the Macedonians captured the Persian camp, where the king's mother, wife, and daughters were being held. Alexander only arrived after organizing the camp and tending to the wounded. He entered with Hephaestion, his companion, who was taller and more regal in appearance. The women, still weeping, knelt before Hephaestion, believing him to be Alexander. Embarrassed, Sisygambis realized her mistake and begged forgiveness. Alexander, smiling, lifted her up and said, "You too weren't wrong, mother. He too is Alexander." With that gallant phrase, he preserved the Queen Mother's dignity and publicly honored Hephaestion. Alexander astonished many by treating the royal prisoners with extreme respect and courtesy. He personally ensured the queen's safety and comfort, showing generosity and magnanimity rarely seen in war at the time. This compassionate treatment helped build his image as a just and noble leader, earning him respect and even sympathy from some of his former enemies. The victory at Issus marked a turning point both politically and militarily. The outcome of the battle deeply shook the morale of the Persian troops and spread a sense of vulnerability throughout the empire. For the Macedonians, the moral impact was the opposite. Their confidence and determination surged, strengthening their belief in the legitimacy and grand destiny of Alexander's campaign. After the victory, Alexander ordered that the city of Issus be treated with respect and restraint. Avoiding reckless looting, he sought to implement a clear policy of protecting civilian populations, ensuring their safety and minimizing local resentment. However, the city was required to provide an indemnity and supplies to support the campaign, securing vital logistical support for the Macedonian advance. The defeat at Issus had immediate and severe consequences for the structure of the Persian Empire. Confidence in Darius III was badly shaken among his generals and nobles, triggering internal divisions and seriously weakening the empire's political and military cohesion. Provinces that had once been loyal began to reconsider their alliances, recognizing the vulnerability of an empire that had seemed invincible. The loss of the royal family intensified the emotional and political blow, leading many regional leaders to openly question Darius's ability to maintain unity and authority over his vast lands. With his decisive victory at Issus, Alexander realized he had to seize the momentum and secure control of the Mediterranean coast, planning to capture all coastal cities and eliminate the Persian naval threat at his rear. He aimed to strengthen his position as much as possible before Darius could reorganize his army for another confrontation. After his monumental victory at the Battle of Issus, where he humbled the Persian leader, Alexander turned his focus to Tyre, one of the most important and strategically vital cities on the Phoenician coast. Tyre was an economic linchpin in the Mediterranean, but it was also an apparently impregnable fortress, situated on a fortified island. Before Alexander's arrival, the city of Tyre already boasted a millennia-old history of prominence and power in the Mediterranean. Founded on a rocky island off what is now Lebanon's coast, Tyre emerged as the foremost city-state of Phoenicia, a maritime civilization that dominated trade for centuries. Its strategic location and well-protected harbor made it a vital trading hub, linking the Near East with the Mediterranean basin. The Tyrians were unrivaled sailors and merchants, known for exporting the precious purple dye, extracted from local mollusks and a symbol of royalty and wealth throughout the ancient world, as well as cedar wood, glass, and other manufactured goods. Politically, Tyre was ruled by a monarchy subject to Persia, lending its ports to serve as bases for the powerful Persian navy, largely staffed by Phoenician ships and sailors. Upon reaching Tyre's vicinity, Alexander initially sought to negotiate a peaceful surrender, aware of the city's importance to his campaign. However, the Tyrian leaders categorically rejected the Macedonian proposals, confident in their robust defenses and the maritime protection provided by the great Persian fleet. Alexander had clear reasons to prioritize Tyre's capture that went far beyond its obvious economic and military value. Politically, taking Tyre would send a powerful message to the other Phoenician cities and to the still resistant Persian provinces, showing that not even the mightiest fortresses could stand against the Macedonian advance. Strategically, controlling Tyre would allow Alexander to secure the entire Phoenician coast, neutralizing the Persian naval threat in the Mediterranean and guaranteeing the essential logistical support for his future campaigns. The siege posed immediate and significant challenges. Tyre's island fortress was defended by strong walls and a well-equipped navy. To overcome these obstacles, Alexander undertook an impressive feat of engineering, building a massive causeway to link the island to the mainland, allowing his troops to advance directly to the walls. To achieve this monumental work, Alexander mobilized thousands of soldiers and laborers, who hauled enormous quantities of rock, earth, and timber to construct the causeway. They used tree trunks and large stone blocks as a foundation, filling in between them with earth to create a solid surface. For months, the Macedonian forces toiled relentlessly to build the causeway, enduring frequent, well-coordinated attacks by the Tyrian defenders. Tyrian vessels launched aggressive and effective assaults with fire ships and swift raids against the builders, significantly delaying the project's progress. The responsibility for breaking the Macedonian blockade and securing essential supplies and reinforcements for Tyre rested heavily on the powerful Persian navy. The Persian fleet, manned largely by Phoenician ships famed for their speed, maneuverability, and combat prowess, repeatedly attempted decisive maritime strikes against Alexander's forces. Their main objective was to destroy the nearly completed causeway and reopen a supply corridor to the besieged city. However, the combined and coordinated action of the naval contingents from the coastal cities, already conquered by Alexander, formed an effective barrier, progressively neutralizing the Persian incursions and preventing reinforcements from reaching Tyre. Slowly but surely, the causeway took shape, inching forward under constant Tyrian attack, until at last it became a secure ramp for the Macedonian siege engines to reach the city walls. At the same time, Macedonian engineers and specialists developed and deployed advanced siege technologies, movable assault towers, long-range catapults, and reinforced battering rams specifically adapted to Tyre's sturdy defenses. The prolonged siege of Tyre proved one of the toughest challenges the Macedonian army had ever faced, testing their military skill as well as their physical and psychological endurance. Months of back-breaking labor on the causeway under constant threat from enemy assaults wore down the soldiers, who had to fend off frequent Tyrian sorties and sabotage attempts. Additionally, adverse weather, heavy rains, and strong winds added to the operation's difficulty, directly affecting the troops' health and morale. Yet Alexander's determination and leadership were crucial in keeping his forces united and motivated, inspiring them through his presence and decisive strategic choices. On the other side, the inhabitants of Tyre displayed extraordinary resilience, driven by their resolve to defend their homes and independence. Their prolonged resistance impressed even Alexander himself. With the causeway finally completed and the imposing siege towers in position before the walls, Alexander prepared for the final blow. He orchestrated a massive, coordinated assault, synchronizing his land forces, advancing along the causeway with his navy, tasked with attacking the city's harbors to split the Tyrian defenses. Catapults and battering rams placed at the end of the causeway relentlessly pounded the southern walls until a breach was finally forced. Leading the charge personally, Alexander and his elite troops were the first to enter the city through the gap, while his fleets, under their commanders, stormed the northern and southern harbors, neutralizing the remaining Tyrian ships. What followed was a brutal massacre. The fury of the Macedonian soldiers, accumulated over 7 grueling months of siege warfare, was unleashed upon the narrow streets of Tyre. Although the Tyrian defenders fought bravely to the last, they were crushed by the invaders' tactical superiority and ferocity. The battle devolved into house-to-house slaughter, and few were spared. Alexander's victory was sealed with exemplary cruelty, intended as a lesson for the entire Persian Empire. The price of Tyre's stubbornness was staggering. Ancient sources report that about 8,000 Tyrians fell during the assault and street fighting. In an act of vengeance for the defenders' ferocity and the Macedonian losses, Alexander ordered 2,000 fighting-age men to be crucified along the coast, a macabre spectacle underscoring the cost of disobedience. The remaining 30,000 inhabitants, including women and children, were sold into slavery, sealing the fate of one of the greatest cities of its time. Only those who sought refuge in the Temple of Melqart, among them King Azamilcus, and a few noble families, were spared. Alexander's reaction to this costly victory was one of mixed relief. He had overcome a challenge considered impossible, proving that neither nature nor the most formidable human defenses could halt his advance. Strategically, Tyre's fall marked a decisive turning point. The Persian naval threat in the Mediterranean was annihilated, Macedonian supply lines were secured, and the road to Egypt lay completely open. The siege of Tyre was not merely a military triumph. It stood as the ultimate proof of Alexander's indomitable will and his ability to conquer the unconquerable, paving the way for the conquest of the rest of the known world. After the brilliant capture of Tyre, Alexander and his army, exhausted but victorious, knew their journey was far from over. Alexander's strategy was clear. Before marching on the heart of Persia and confronting Darius III, he needed to neutralize the enemy's naval power completely. To do so, it was imperative to seize control of every port along the eastern Mediterranean. With Phoenicia now under his dominion, only one final obstacle stood between him and Egypt: the ancient fortified city of Gaza. While still at Tyre, Alexander demanded that the high priest of Jerusalem, Jadus, send him troops and supplies. Jadus refused, citing his oath of loyalty to Darius. Furious, Alexander vowed to march on the city and punish it as soon as Gaza fell. Perched strategically atop a hill, Gaza was the last Persian stronghold on the Levantine coast, and the principal trading hub controlling the desert routes to Egypt and Arabia. The city was commanded by Batis, a eunuch whose loyalty to Darius was unshakable. Confident in his city's imposing walls and stocked with ample supplies for a long siege, Batis refused to surrender. He stared down the approaching Macedonian army and saw only another challenge to repel. Alexander arrived before Gaza, expecting swift submission. But Batis's defiance enraged him. The conqueror couldn't let an act of defiance go unpunished. It would be seen as weakness by the rest of the empire. The siege was declared. However, the task proved more arduous than anticipated. Gaza's walls were so high that the siege engines brought from Tyre were useless. Under Alexander's watchful eye, the Macedonian engineers concluded that the only solution was to raise the ground itself. Thus began one of the most impressive feats of military engineering in antiquity. Thousands of soldiers and laborers set to work building a massive earthen ramp around the city. Day and night they moved sand and stone, raising an artificial hill that slowly reached the height of the walls. During this colossal effort, Gaza's defenders were anything but idle. Archers rained an unceasing hail of arrows and launched surprise sorties, turning the construction site into a daily battlefield. In one of these clashes, Alexander, always at the forefront to inspire his men, was gravely wounded. An arrow fired from the wall pierced his breastplate and lodged deep in his shoulder. The wound was serious, and the king was hurried to his tent. News that their leader lay at death's door sparked panic in the Macedonian camp. But to everyone's relief, Alexander survived. His recovery, however, only fueled his fury and determination to crush Gaza. Finally, after 2 months of relentless labor, the ramp was complete. The siege engines were positioned, and the final assault began. Battering rams hammered at the walls, while assault towers poured soldiers onto the defenses. 3 times the Macedonians attacked, and 3 times they were repelled by Batis's fierce resistance. On the 4th attempt, led by a recovered Alexander thirsting for revenge, his troops finally breached the walls. What followed was a massacre. Consumed by rage, Alexander showed no mercy. Every fighting-age man was killed, his soldiers' blades taking some 10,000 lives. Women and children were torn from their homes and sold into slavery, the fate that was becoming the standard for those who dared defy the young conqueror. Gaza, the proud desert fortress, was turned into a silent tomb. But the fate of its commander, Batis, was the most terrible of all. Captured alive, the loyal eunuch was dragged before Alexander. Even in defeat, Batis refused to bow or acknowledge Alexander as his master. He stood silent, staring at his executioner with defiant scorn. Alexander declared that Batis would suffer the same fate as Hector at the hands of Achilles, the hero he idolized. Batis's heels were pierced, and leather straps bound him to the back of Alexander's chariot. The conqueror then whipped his horses, dragging the valiant defender's body around the city walls he had so bravely defended, until his life was brutally extinguished. With Gaza subdued and the road to Egypt open, Alexander resumed his march south. It is at this point in his story that one of the most enigmatic and debated episodes of his life appears: his visit to Jerusalem. News of Gaza's fall and Alexander's approach struck panic in Jerusalem. Jadus, the high priest, in desperation ordered public sacrifices and prayers. He proclaimed that his God had appeared to him in a dream and instructed him not to fear. He was to adorn the city, open its gates, and go out to meet Alexander, dressed in full ceremonial robes, accompanied by priests in white linen and the citizens. So it was done. When Alexander saw the procession approaching, he was surprised. His generals had expected an order to sack the city, but instead they saw their king dismount his horse, walk forward alone, and bow before the high priest. Perplexed, his general Parmenion asked why he, whom all worshipped, was bowing to the Jewish priest. Alexander replied that he was not worshipping the man but the god whose holy name he bore on his tiara. He then told them that, back in Macedonia before beginning his campaign, he'd had a dream in which a figure dressed exactly like Jadus urged him to cross into Asia, promising that this very god would guide his army and give him the Persian Empire. Led into the city, Alexander was taken to the temple, where he offered sacrifices according to Jewish tradition. He was then shown the Book of Daniel, in which a prophecy foretold that a Greek king would come to destroy the Persian Empire. Enchanted, Alexander believed himself to be the fulfillment of that prophecy and granted the Jews the right to live under their own laws and exempted them from taxes during their sabbatical years. This story, however, is met with extreme skepticism by most modern historians. The chief argument against its veracity is the argument from silence. None of the Greek or Roman historians who serve as primary sources on Alexander, such as Arrian, Plutarch, or Diodorus, mention such an extraordinary event. It seems inconceivable that a detour to Jerusalem and such a miraculous meeting would have gone unnoticed by all of them. The only source that records this event is the 1st century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Moreover, scholars point out that the Book of Daniel was most likely written in the 2nd century BC, almost 200 years after Alexander's death, making the prophecy an anachronism. The prevailing view is that Josephus's account is nothing more than a legend, created later to elevate the prestige of Jerusalem and the Jewish priesthood, integrating his people into the grand Hellenistic narrative. Gaza chose resistance and was met with exemplary terror and annihilation. Its destruction served as a warning to all others. Jerusalem, in Josephus's story, chose submission and was rewarded with respect, autonomy, and divine favor. After laying waste to Tyre and Gaza, Macedonian control over the Phoenician coast and Palestine was now uncontested. Persian naval dominance in the Mediterranean, which had for so long threatened his lines of communication with Greece, was broken. Many generals, intoxicated by such victories, would have marched straight eastward into the beating heart of the Persian Empire in search of a final showdown with Darius. But Alexander was not like the others. His strategic vision was as grand as his ambition. He understood that advancing on Babylon and Persepolis with an unstable rear would be a fatal mistake. To the south lay the wealthiest region under Persian control, the lands of Egypt. To Alexander, Egypt was more than a prize. It was the key to a mighty empire. That region was the granary of the Mediterranean, an inexhaustible source of grain to feed his army in campaigns that would last years. It was a land of fabulous wealth, whose treasures could bankroll his endless wars. And crucially, it was the final Persian naval base. Leaving Egypt in Persian hands would be like pointing a dagger at his back. Since Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, had conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, relations between Achaemenid rulers and their Egyptian subjects had been, at best, tense, and more often, openly hostile. The first century of Persian rule was marked by profound cultural and religious insensitivity. Cambyses had desecrated temples and mocked Egyptian gods, even fatally wounding the sacred Apis bull, the incarnation of the god Ptah. This sacrilege offended generations of priests and nobles who never forgot. The Persians ruled with an iron fist. Heavy taxes were levied to fill the great king's coffers in Susa, draining Egypt's wealth. Persian satraps were installed in Memphis, often showing little respect for the complex administrative and religious traditions that had governed Egypt for 3 millennia. When Alexander marched south, the satrap in Egypt was a man named Mazaces. His position was untenable. The garrisons he commanded were largely Greek mercenaries, whose loyalty was, at best, doubtful. He had heard the terrifying accounts of Tyre's fall and Gaza's destruction, and he knew that Darius, after his defeat at Issus, had retreated into his empire's interior to raise a new army, leaving the western provinces to fend for themselves. Mazaces was isolated, ruling a populace that hated him, with an army unwilling to fight for him, and facing a conqueror who seemed invincible. Egypt was ripe for the taking, a fruit ready to fall into the hands of whoever shook the tree first. The 7-day march across the arid desert separating Gaza from Pelusium, the eastern fortress of the Nile Delta, was the final test of the Macedonian army's endurance. Upon arrival, instead of defended walls and a hail of arrows, they found the gates wide open. Mazaces offered no resistance. He understood the futility of battle. Surrendering to Alexander was not only the safest choice, it was the only logical one. He handed over the fortress and the treasure it held. News of Pelusium's peaceful surrender spread along the Nile. To the Egyptians, it was not an exchange of one master for another, but the arrival of a liberator. Alexander, the Greek who had humiliated the hated Persians, was seen as the instrument of divine vengeance. As he sailed upriver toward the administrative capital of Memphis, riverside villages and towns exploded in celebration. Crowds pressed the riverbanks to hail the conqueror, not with fear, but with relief and hope. The entry into Memphis was a triumph. No sword was drawn, no blood was spilled. Satrap Mazaces greeted Alexander and formally surrendered the city, along with the remainder of Egypt's treasure. The populace cheered him. The powerful priests of Ptah, the guardians of Egypt's religious soul, saw in Alexander the opportunity to restore their god's honor and their temple's prominence. Alexander played the liberator perfectly. His first act in Memphis was not to impose his will, but to pay homage to the gods. He offered lavish sacrifices not to the gods of Olympus, but to the Egyptian pantheon, and, most significantly, to the Apis bull. This gesture was a masterpiece of public relations. It signaled to all of Egypt that he was not an oppressor like the Persians, but a ruler who understood and honored the sacred traditions of their land. Alexander's legitimacy was sealed in the great temple of Ptah at Memphis. There, in a ceremony rich with millennia-old symbolism, he was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt. Receiving the double crown, representing the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, he ceased to be merely a Macedonian king and a Greek general. He became a divine figure in the eyes of his new subjects, the sacred intermediary between gods and humanity, the guarantor of Ma'at, the cosmic order, truth, and justice. Being pharaoh was not just a political title, it was a priestly office, and Alexander embraced both roles. His coronation marked the culmination of his integrationist policy. By becoming pharaoh, the priests, who might have been a source of resistance, became his greatest allies, proclaiming his legitimacy in every temple along the Nile. With political and religious power consolidated, Alexander turned his attention to the future, to crafting a lasting legacy. He traveled to the Mediterranean coast, to the western edge of the Nile Delta. There, on a narrow strip of land between the sea and the vast Mareotis Lake, he found the perfect site for his grand ambition. It was there that Alexander personally sketched the outlines of his new city. The city would be called Alexandria. Alexander's vision for Alexandria was monumental. It would not be merely a trading post or a military fortress, but the new center of the world, a cosmopolitan metropolis where Greek culture would meet and merge with Egyptian wisdom and Eastern riches. It would be a city of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and merchants from every corner of the known world. He laid out the agora, the royal palaces, temples for Greek and Egyptian gods, and planted the seed of what would become the greatest center of knowledge in antiquity, the Museion, and its great library. The founding of Alexandria was Alexander's most prophetic act, the creation of a beacon that would shine for centuries, long after his empire had dissolved. Those lands stirred a deep fascination in the young conqueror, one that drove him on one of the most extraordinary journeys of his life. He decided to undertake a pilgrimage to the remote oasis of Siwa, in the heart of the Libyan desert, to consult the famed oracle of Amun. The Siwa oracle was revered throughout the ancient world. The Greeks had long identified the Egyptian god Amun, the hidden one, with their own king of gods, Zeus, forging the syncretic deity Zeus Amun. Consulting this oracle was to seek the word of the supreme god. The journey was a trial by fire, 500 kilometers of merciless desert, with no roads or known water sources. Alexander's caravan lost its way, and water supplies ran dry. When disaster seemed imminent, accounts claim the divine intervened. A sudden torrential rain saved the army from thirst, and 2 ravens appeared to guide the expedition along the correct path to the verdant oasis. Upon reaching Siwa, Alexander was received with unprecedented honors. Contrary to custom, the high priest invited him into the Sanctum Sanctorum, the most sacred inner chamber. The exact questions and answers of the consultation remained a secret between Alexander and the oracle, a mystery he would take to his grave. Yet the public outcome was unmistakable and transformative. Upon leaving the temple, the high priest hailed Alexander not as a mere mortal, but as the son of Amun. This belief would profoundly shape his future actions, his self-perception, and his sometimes tense relationship with his Macedonian companions, who still saw him as first among equals, not as a god king. Alexander returned from the desert a changed man, his authority and sense of divine purpose affirmed. His time in Egypt, lasting about 6 months, was drawing to a close. Before departing, he set up a new, complex administrative structure for Egypt, one that reflected his distrust of concentrated power. Astutely, he divided authority. Military command was entrusted to 2 Macedonian generals, while civil administration was shared by 2 governors. The critical task of tax collection and financial management was assigned to Cleomenes of Naucratis, a local Greek. While notorious for his corruption, Alexander likely tolerated his greed in exchange for his proven efficiency and results. With Egypt pacified, loyal, and well organized, the machinery of his grand strategy was in place. Grain shipments to feed his troops were secured. The Nile's wealth filled his coffers. His southern flank and the Mediterranean were safe. No threats remained to his rear. In the spring of 331 BCE, Alexander was ready. Leaving Cleomenes in overall command, he marched out of Egypt, back across the desert, and into Asia. He was now more than king of Macedonia and leader of the Corinthian League. He was the great king of Asia Minor and the Levant, and the pharaoh of Egypt, son of Amun. With this new identity and the resources of the world's oldest land at his disposal, he set his sights eastward, the heart of the Persian Empire, and his decisive confrontation with Darius awaited. The Nile, which for centuries had witnessed the rise and fall of gods and pharaohs, now watched Alexander depart, crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He left behind a carefully restructured administration, and along the Mediterranean coast, the seed of an immortal city that would bear his name, Alexandria. With Egypt secure and his fleet now master of the seas, the young king turned his gaze eastward. The true prize, the heart of the Persian lion, still beat, and Alexander fixed his spear directly on it. The march back through Phoenicia and Syria was a demonstration of power and purpose. The Macedonian army, a serpent of bronze and steel nearly 50,000 strong, moved with terrifying efficiency. Alexander did not rush into a blind pursuit of the Persian king. He knew that Darius, wounded in pride after his defeat at Issus, would not make the same mistake of being cornered in a tight space. This time, the confrontation would be on the great king's terms, on a vast plain where his numbers could finally crush the invader. As Alexander advanced, Darius III orchestrated the greatest mobilization the Achaemenid Empire had ever seen. From his capital in Babylon, messengers galloped to the farthest satrapies. From the Scythian steppes came mounted archers, men born in the saddle. From the mountains of Bactria, the noble heavy cavalry led by satrap Bessus. And from the plains of India, warriors and 15 war elephants, colossal beasts that seemed incarnations of nature's fury. It was an army that spoke 100 tongues, a mosaic of nations united by a single goal: to annihilate Alexander. Darius left nothing to chance. His strategists chose the decisive battlefield with meticulous care, a vast plain near the village of Gaugamela. For weeks, workers leveled the ground, removing every obstacle, bush or stone, that might hamper the charge of his deadliest weapon: 200 scythed chariots designed to mow down Macedonian infantry like ripe wheat. Darius was literally shaping the battlefield for his victory, turning the land into a deadly trap. Aware of the immense force gathering, Alexander trusted his secret eyes and ears. His network of scouts and spies, led by agile and cunning men, was the spearhead of his intelligence. They captured Persian scouts who, under pressure, revealed the terrifying scale and location of Darius's army. The great king was no longer fleeing. He awaited his conqueror with confidence. When the two armies were finally only days apart, a final Persian embassy arrived at Alexander's camp. Darius's offer was impressive, a confession of his own anxiety. He offered Alexander the hand of his daughter in marriage, a formal alliance, and all territory of the empire west of the Euphrates River. It was a reward that would exceed any conqueror's wildest dreams. In Alexander's tent, his oldest and most trusted general, Parmenion, weighed the offer. "If I were Alexander, I'd accept." Alexander's reply entered legend, echoing his boundless ambition. "I'd accept too, if I were Parmenion. But I am Alexander. Kings don't bargain for lands, they conquer them. And I don't steal my victories." The war would go on. On the eve of battle, the two worlds faced each other. Alexander's army of 47,000 men was a weapon of lethal precision. At its core stood the phalanx, 16 ranks of sarissas, forming an impenetrable wall of spear points. On the flanks were the elite, the silver-shielded hypaspists, and of course, the crown jewel, the companion cavalry, 2,000 of the finest horsemen in the world, led in person by their king. They were veterans, men who had bled together from Greece to Egypt, united by unwavering faith in their commander. Across the plain stretched a human torrent that ancient sources estimate at over 200,000 men. A number perhaps exaggerated, but one that reflects the terror it inspired. The Persian line ran for miles. Bactrian and Scythian cavalry, swift and deadly, anchored the flanks. In the center stood the 10,000 immortals, the king's personal guard, and Greek mercenaries who fought with the same discipline as Alexander's phalanx. And in front, like the teeth of a dragon, were the scythed chariots and war elephants, waiting for the signal to unleash chaos. The disparity was clear: quality versus quantity, discipline versus brute force. The commander's psychology that night sealed the battle's fate. Darius, fearing a surprise nighttime attack on his vast, undisciplined camp, ordered his entire army to remain under arms, standing in formation. Throughout the night, by torchlight, tens of thousands of men kept watch, their energy and morale draining with each passing hour. In the Macedonian camp, a surprising calm reigned. After inspecting the terrain and finalizing his plans, Alexander ordered his men to eat and rest. He himself withdrew to his tent and slept so deeply that his generals had to have his servants wake him at dawn. He wasn't anxious. He was ready. He didn't fear tomorrow, for he had already conquered it in his mind. At dawn on October 1st, 331 BCE, the sun rose over a field destined to become an altar of sacrifice. Mounted on his beloved Bucephalus, Alexander rode before his troops. He didn't give a long speech. His men didn't need words. Just a reminder: they weren't fighting for pay, but for glory. They weren't fighting for a distant king, but beside a brother in arms. In the final war council, he outlined a bold strategy: an asymmetric response to the Persians' overwhelming strength. The two forces took their positions on the battlefield. The Persian line stretched like a great wave, poised to engulf the Macedonian army and sweep it from the map. Alexander's formation was different: compact, flexible, and surprisingly deep. He'd posted a second line of infantry behind the main one, ordered to wheel and fight if flanked. His right wing was advanced, and his left formed an oblique angle, an unusual shape on the war chessboard. The battle began. Alexander led his right wing in a diagonal march, moving steadily to the right, parallel to the enemy line. Darius and his generals watched in confusion. Alexander seemed to be marching out of the carefully prepared battlefield. Fearing the Macedonians might escape or outflank his entire line, Darius ordered his left-wing cavalry to intercept Alexander, stretching and thinning his already long formation. Spotting the enemy cavalry on the move, Darius gave the decisive signal. The scythed chariots advanced. It was a terrifying spectacle: the roar of wheels, the neighing of horses, and spinning blades ready to slice flesh and bone. But Alexander had anticipated it. The light Macedonian infantry, the Granians, advanced and unleashed a hail of javelins at the horses and drivers. At the same time, the front line of the phalanx opened its ranks, creating corridors in their formation. Chariots that survived the barrage rolled harmlessly through these corridors, only to be surrounded and neutralized by soldiers from the rear. The Persians' surprise weapon had failed. Alexander's maneuver and the Persian cavalry's charge to contain him created exactly what he had hoped for: a point of tension, a fracture in the Persian front line. Near the center left, where the cavalry had broken off to pursue Alexander, a gap opened. It lasted only an instant, but an instant was all Alexander needed. He wheeled his companion cavalry into a perfect wedge, with himself at its tip, and plunged into the opening. The daring charge surged like a missile aimed directly at the heart of the Persian army: Darius himself, in his magnificent war chariot. The shock was brutal. The companions, with their long lances, shredded the Persian royal guard. Terror spread. Darius, from his elevated position, saw the demonic gleam in Alexander's eyes, the dust and blood, and the wedge of Macedonian cavalry carving a path of death straight toward him. He was not a coward by nature, but what he saw was not a man. It was a force of nature. In a moment of panic that sealed his empire's fate, Darius pulled his chariot's reins and fled. The Persian center, seeing the royal chariot vanish in a cloud of dust, collapsed. Their commander was gone. Their will to fight evaporated. Panic turned into a disorderly rout. Victory seemed total. Alexander, at the height of his triumph, prepared to pursue and capture Darius, an act that would end the war once and for all. But then, a desperate messenger arrived, covered in dust and blood. On the left flank, the situation was catastrophic. Parmenion, facing Bessus's heavy Bactrian cavalry, and the Indian horsemen, was on the brink of collapse. The Macedonian line had been broken, and the Macedonian camp was being looted. Alexander faced the hardest choice of his life. Should he chase Darius in total glory, risking the annihilation of part of his army? Or should he abandon the king's pursuit to save his men? His decision defined his character as a commander. With torturing frustration, Alexander halted the pursuit. He felt he could not abandon the men who had sacrificed everything to secure his victory. So he rallied his cavalry and, instead of heading east after Darius, wheeled and attacked the Persian horsemen ravaging his left flank. The battle was won. The plain of Gaugamela, prepared to be the Macedonian army's tomb, became the Achaemenid Empire's graveyard. The pursuit of fugitives lasted until nightfall. Persian casualties were immense, in the tens of thousands. In the silence that followed, Alexander rode into the Persian camp. There he found Darius's personal treasure, his chariot, his bow, and, most importantly, his mother, wife, and children, who were treated with the honors due royalty. That night, Alexander was no longer just king of Macedonia or pharaoh of Egypt. He was the great king, lord of Asia. The sun had set on 3 centuries of Persian glory, and a new dawn was breaking on the horizon. The Hellenistic age had begun.